Casino Royale by Ian Fleming. Read by Dan Stevens. I hadn't read this book before. I had seen the film adaptation, the recent one, but no, I hadn't read this book. I'd read a couple of the others when I was younger, but not for a while. I really enjoyed it. It was the structure of it surprised me. I'd sort of forgotten perhaps what the structure of the Bond books was, and I don't know if it's the same for all of them, but certainly this one is very much in three parts, and you have the casino section with the intrigue and the suspense of this high-stakes game with Le Chiffre. And then it goes into this rather horrible sort of torture sequence, it just becomes quite a different book in the middle. And then it gets all sort of mushy and romantic at the end, which I hadn't really associated with Bond so much. I mean, I know he always gets the girl, but I didn't know it got quite so sort of romantically involved and, with these questions of marriage floating around. That certainly took me by surprise. I think probably the oddest thing I found was the romantic section, really, and these long passages of sort of introspection and reflection about the nature of his profession and considerations of his future and romantic future and his happiness and all these sorts of things that I always thought Bond was about, sort of covert operations, killing and gadgets and cars, and actually he goes for sort of long dips in the sea and thinks about when he's going to settle down. I think this being the first book, that obviously changes in later books, and perhaps he becomes a slightly more hardened character. I don't know if he does really. Perhaps he doesn't. I need to go away and read the later ones, I think. But that definitely surprised me that that he was a bit more of a softie than we give him credit for in the movies, I think. I think for the voice of Bond, I just sort of tried to do a slightly suave version of myself. I think it's very difficult not to end up imitating any of the the many great Bonds there have been. I obviously didn't want to do a Sean Connery. That would be not good. And I think of any of them, I probably sound closest to sort of Roger Moore or something. But that was by chance. I think not by any sort of active choice that I was going to pick, Dalton or Brosnan to sort of go with. So yes, he's quite a smooth operator and pretty cool customer. So I don't think he doesn't need a particular voice to be put on. I think it's just it's more the qualities of the character that you sort of look to find, I think. I like the character of Felix Leiter. I think that's when Leiter basically is he's representing all Americans, or certainly I guess a certain attitude to Americans, and so he sort of stands for the CIA versus our Secret Service way of doing things, and so there's quite a nice bit of sort of comic drama between the two ways of doing things, and I enjoyed finding a voice for him. I suppose Le Chiffre, I don't know who I was basing it on, really. It's tricky because although he's probably from somewhere in Europe, it says that he doesn't speak with an accent, that he speaks sort of perfect English. It also says he's sort of quite softly and quietly spoken, and also quite fat, or you get the impression that he's not, if not obese, he's certainly sort of thick set. So again, it's just sort of, you sort of think your voice into those characteristics, and then it sort of comes up, a bit like that. It was great fun to do. Really great fun. It was, it's just, it's such an institution, a sort of national institution, the whole Bond thing. And I've certainly grown up with the films probably more than the books, although I did read some of the books when I was younger. And it's just a great privilege, and it's lovely to sort of get your head into the entire book and think yourself into all the characters, not just the obvious ones. Just to sort of get inside their heads and their voices. It was great fun.
Moonraker by Ian Fleming. Read by Bill Nye. I hadn't read the book before. I'm surprised that I hadn't read the book before. I sort of imagined that I had, but I hadn't. It was a surprise to me how well written it was. I don't know why. I suppose because I made a familiar, lazy assumption that if it were a genre novel, broadly speaking, that it might not be of the first rank in terms of writing. I was mistaken. It's an assumption one should never make. And Ian Fleming writes beautifully, and in every department he makes it thrilling, and the adventure side of things is very satisfactory, as are the romantic elements also. What I found interesting, and again surprising, was how delicately and how marvellously the romantic elements of the book were dealt with. And I was pleasantly surprised that James Bond wasn't as casual or sort of callous in his contact with the woman in the book as I'd kind of been led to believe. It was a proper kind of tender experience that they shared. Obviously, I don't want Krebs moving in next door and marrying my daughter. That's pretty well established. And Drax, the physical description of Drax, just reading it made me physically uncomfortable. He is so minutely described, and with such glee, I would suggest, from the writer, and is such a deeply unpleasant creation. I loved, not to surprise anybody, I don't suppose, Gala Brand. I like everything about Gala. I like her hair, I like her skirts, I like her shirts, and I like her throat.
Diamonds Are Forever by Ian Fleming. Read by Damian Lewis. I'd never read Diamonds Are Forever before, and in spite of being a lifelong James Bond fan, I actually hadn't read most of them. I'd read Dr. No, Live and Let Die, Spy Who Loved Me, and I one other, but only 3 or 4. This is a fantastic book. The Spangled Mob and the Spang brothers are fantastic creations. And, of course, the delightful Tiffany Case. James Bond is asked whether he likes red hair or not, provided the collars and cuffs match. She's a fantastic creation too. Dark, really representative of Ian Fleming's dark side, not afraid to be brutal when he needs to be, and mixing that with the cartoonish-like characters of Winter and Kitteridge, known as Wint and Kit, in this, makes for a very heady cocktail, I think. In terms of the characters that I've enjoyed, I think Felix Leiter is a fabulous character because he's a really fun, enjoyable person to be with. He's the best friend, if you like, and he has a lot of exposition, Felix Leiter, just from a technical point of view in the stories, but it's conveyed to you by someone that the audience really like and want to be with, and so I think that's quite a clever literary device. Any man of my generation probably has had a fantasy at one time or another about being James Bond. That's what they say about James Bond, isn't it? That all the girls fantasize about him, about being with him, and all the men fantasize about being him. So he's much loved. What was particularly interesting about this book, I love the way in which Ian Fleming writes set pieces. He goes into great detail, whether it's an Atlantic cruise crossing or a set piece with the locomotive when Serafimo Spang is finally laid to rest. They're gone into in great detail, and the energy and the verve of the writing is self-evident. It's a lot of fun. It's been a lot of fun to read.
Dr. No by Ian Fleming. Read by Hugh Quashie. I had read Dr. No, but I read it after seeing the film, so I read it through the prism of Sean Connery's performance, and reading the book I was surprised to find that James Bond wasn't Scottish, and that he was actually very English and had been in the war in the Navy. It's interesting to think that the book was written in 1958, but the film came out in 1962, the same year as Jamaican independence. So the book is written in the colonial era, and the film is post-colonial. It's quite interesting that the film shows Bond to be quite unsentimental and quite unapologetic when he kills. But in the book, he really is quite fond of Jamaica and the Jamaicans, particularly of Quarrel. He has a kind of streak of sentimentality, which the film Bond doesn't seem to have. And it's interesting that he almost apologizes for killing people. Sorry, honey, I'm going to have to kill these men. There's also a quality of Englishness in the book that doesn't really come across in the film. You know, when his mind starts wandering in the acting governor's office and goes back to all the things that he remembers about England, the tube trains, the Forsythia, the kings and queens, the tea, his cleaning lady waking up to make tea. That's a kind of Englishness that you only ever notice when you're out of England. And it strikes me too that Dr. No is a villain very much in the tradition of villains of English adventure novels, like Rider Haggard and Buchan, you know, and you know that he's going to come to a sticky end, because whereas M notices Bond trying to steal the Beretta, Dr. No doesn't notice Bond secreting the knife and the table lighter away. So he's not nearly the match of our man M. Reading it again, you realize that Bond has to call on reserves of cunning and of strength and of resolve. He has to improvise his weapons. He doesn't have the gadgets that the film Bond had. He loses his gun, and so he has to steal a knife, he has to steal a table lighter, and makes a sort of spear out of wire. He's a kind of MacGyver before MacGyver. The way that it was written, it was obviously very plot-led, and there's a lot of plot and exposition thinly disguised as conversation when Dr. No gives his potted history in a way that perhaps you wouldn't find so much in a modern novel. So it is very forward. It has a very forward drive. Bond's thoughts are always on the surface of things, except strangely when his mind wanders in the Governor General's office and he thinks about all the things that make him what he is, a British Secret Service man. Honey Child Rider was always going to be a challenge. Playing a 20-year-old, lithe, sexy, white, wild child, as well as playing a 60-year-old German, Chinese, American villain, and of course all the toffs and the mandarins that run the Secret Service. For me, it's actually quite pleasing to have done this entire array of the upper-class English people. For me, it's been quite challenging and actually quite satisfying that I should be playing James Bond as well as all the other upper-class Englishmen who run the Secret Service, as well as playing Quarrel, and as well as playing the Chinese-German villain. Playing Quarrel perhaps came a little bit more naturally, a bit more easily, than trying to find a voice for Honey Child Rider. She was quite a challenge, but I hope I imbued her with the sexiness that she deserved.
From Russia with Love by Ian Fleming. Read by Toby Stevens. I had read the book, actually. I read all of the Bond books when I was in my mid to late teens. I think I started reading them when I was about 14 or 15, and I just sort of chewed my way through them. I mean, I'd seen the films and had been intrigued through the early films, and so I wanted to read all of the books myself. Well, I think for me, From Russia with Love was one of my favourite of the Bond books, because it is so couched in that period, and it is so particular to the Cold War, and it really sees Bond kind of extend himself somehow against Smersh and everything. And I just think it's the most sort of gritty, in a way, of all of the Bond books. And although there's the romance within the novel, it's the most unromantic of the novels in a way as well. It's not sort of that heightened kind of thing. It's very gritty and feels quite real to the period. For me, what is intriguing about doing the books, having been in one of the films, is for the books, there's a very different feeling from the movies. And from, what we've done, hopefully, with the audio version is very different. It's an interpretation of the book. So that it's very true to the books, but it's a different voice. Ian Fleming's voice, when you read the books, is one thing, and then the audiobooks is not, and the films are something very different. So for me, what I love is going back to the books, is sort of going back to what it originally was conceived as, and getting that sort of that feeling and the texture of it, which I think, the Bond films are great, but they've kind of moved, they reinterpreted it and sort of moved away from what it was originally, and it's lovely to go back to that. Yeah, I think particularly in this one, there's a lot of characters with a very large C. And I think I really love all of them. I mean, obviously Rosa Klebb is a great one to play, but I think all of them are great fun, especially the Russians, I mean, I always love playing, it's great for actors to be able to do what actors are supposed to do. I mean, one tends to end up just playing the same thing over and over again, or being required to do that. And what's great fun about doing these kind of things is you get to play all kinds of different people. And I love that, because it really speaks to why I wanted to become an actor in the first place. And it's one of the few areas where you can exercise that. Playing a Bond girl is great fun, so I get to do both sides of the coin, really. I think the sort of death struggle on the train on the Orient Express is brilliant. I think that the preceding chapter, where you have this kind of game, this very tense game between the two characters, Bond and the villain, is brilliantly written. It's incredible, because you really think, I mean, the great thing about, I think, the books, and to a certain extent actually in the film, because I think the film of From Russia with Love is actually a very good one. And it's one of my favorite scenes in all of the films, because you really do think this is it. And it tricks you, even though there's other books. It tricks you into thinking that this is it. Oh my God, Bond is gonna get it in this scene, and he's such a wonderfully written villain. I think he's a very disturbing character, and you really feel for Bond in that situation. I think for anyone who loves the film, I think reading the book or listening to this, hopefully, they will find it even more enjoyable, because I actually think the book is, I mean, as books generally always are, they are better than the films. They just are. They're richer and they're more rewarding an experience. And I think that even though it's different from the film, I think it's better for being different, and it's much more tense actually, and somehow more, it's more believable in a way. You really go along with it. And I particularly love the ending. I think it's such a great cliffhanger. I think finding a voice for Bond, for me, is difficult, because one is surrounded by influences, as it were. But for me, it's really trying to come up with that neutral voice of somebody who is uninflected, actually, in a way. You just want to play somebody he's a very simple character in terms of the way that you should play him, I think. He's very down the line. He's no nonsense. He really is somebody who is about functionality and about getting the job done, simplicity. Apart from the odd moment where there's a little bit of vulnerability, or there's a bit of, which are the interesting things to play. But I think for me, it's always about just being very simple and not trying to laden him with innuendo or anything like that, which he's sort of become. That there's all of that influence from the movies, which is great, works great in the movies and everything. I'm not knocking that, but I think in the books, it's much better just to give him that simplicity and cleanness. I think I must be probably one of the few actors to have done both a Bond villain and Bond himself. But I think that's it's lovely.
Goldfinger by Ian Fleming. Read by Hugh Bonneville. I hadn't read Goldfinger before. I think I'd read Dr. No in my youth, but no, this was my first encounter with this particular book. I think Goldfinger's a real page-turner. I'm struck also by his short sentences he uses quite a lot of the time, and a lot more descriptive passages than I was expecting, particularly when Bond is vulnerable. He gets really quite into the emotional vulnerability of Bond, which I wasn't anticipating, because obviously from the movies you're seeing this man of steel with the occasional little chink in his armour, but really he goes into quite a lot of introspection during this. I was also really captivated by the description of the road trip through France. Clearly, Ian himself had done that trip many times, I suspect, but with the detail of the roads that he was going through and the villages and so on, I found that very atmospheric. I think Ian's attitude to Pussy Galore and her sexuality, for instance, it took me slightly by surprise. I hadn't realised that it was quite so. He was quite as bold as he was in saying that she and her lesbian mob could be turned by the sort of the hand of a good strong man like Bond, which are values that I think we wouldn't espouse today. So I found that quite interesting. I think also it's very hard for me not to compare it to the film, to see how here in the book the attack on Fort Knox is treated, and then how it's very much opened out in the film, and they actually go through with the raid, or the climax of the film takes place inside the vaults and so on. Whereas here it's almost headed off at the pass, and there's another beat of storytelling from Ian that takes us to the end. So it's interesting to compare the structure, which is pretty close, I think, on the whole in the book and the film, particularly the opening sequence, which, as I was reading it, I could really see that opening sequence of the card game by the pool, and I could, of course, see those characters while trying not to impersonate them too much. I think trying to get across Oddjob's voice was quite a challenge, because in the book, he's not only has he got an impenetrable Korean accent, he's also got a hare lip. So that's very intriguing, the grunts and groans of Oddjob. And I think for me, the most challenging section was the bit where all the hoodlums get round the table and you've got 6 people speaking pretty much at once over, to each other. So that was a bit of a challenge, but interesting. And of course, Goldfinger's own rhythms are you can never quite put your finger on where he's from, and that's what I've tried to go for in the voice, that he's this otherness that he has about him. It's stated that he's Eastern European in some way, but has lived in England a long time and is naturalised Brit, I think. Of course, his love of gold, which again perhaps is slightly played down in the film, but in the book you really get a sense of this utter obsession with gold and almost a sexual thrill of it. It almost replaces everything, every other sense in his life, sensual needs in his life becomes just simply gold, which is fascinating. And of course it's visually captured in the film with the gold painting of the body. I think if I was to be, well, I have had one line in a Bond film in the past, in Tomorrow Never Dies, but if I was ever to be recast, I'm sure I would be cast as Carruthers from the Foreign Office, but I think I'd like to play someone like Felix Leiter, who's got a bit of wit, got a bit of banter with Bond, is his own man, but a good, hard soldier to boot. When I went for the audition for Tomorrow Never Dies, the director said, we're looking to cast actors to play the various naval officers on the bridge of various ships and in the control room, navigation room, etc. Because at the climax of the movie, the British Navy take on the Chinese Navy in the South China Seas. So I immediately thought, fantastic, 3 weeks in Thailand, marvellous, beaches, all that. It was 2 days in a simulator in Portsmouth. Of course, whenever you read a book, you cast the voices in your head, and Bond is no exception. He does have a gravitas, he does have a sort of sense of authority, but also he's got a sharp wit. And I think particularly, as I said earlier, I was surprised how much, not sensitivity, but vulnerability Ian Fleming gives him, particularly in this story. I love playing Pussy Galore.
From a View to a Kill by Ian Fleming. Read by Samuel West. I'd read Casino Royale before, which somebody gave me as a present a long time ago, but I didn't know the short stories except by title, which of course doesn't have a lot to do with many of them because the titles were used for the films, but not much of the plot was. I think it's an extraordinary collection, and stylistically it's very different. I know that in Quantum of Solace he was trying to pay homage to Somerset Maugham, which he does beautifully, and stylistically it's very different. But I think they're very spare and sparse, and they leave you wanting more, which any good short story should. And they're properly thrilling in places. I never knew what was going to happen, which is a good sign. I always think of reading audiobooks as casting the book in your head and then getting to play all the parts yourself. So the people I like playing are the people I wouldn't normally get to play. I particularly enjoyed Columbo because anyone who was played by Topol in the film is not someone I would normally audition for. So, if he's spherical and Italian and larger than life, anyone with a different accent or a different feeling of words in the mouth or a different silhouette is always fun to play on tape, because those are the parts that you don't normally get. If it's an accent that I'm not used to, I go to a wonderful website called IDEA, which is the International Dialects of English Archive, and listen to things on that. If it's something I can find on a website elsewhere or by watching short films, I do as much research as I can. If it's an accent that I'm happy in, I suppose I try and keep it subtle so that it doesn't become the accent show. The cast of Ian Fleming short stories very often reads like a sort of European soap opera. There are many, many people, from Algerian sailors to Austrian hostesses and Italian gangsters, often speaking on the same page. So you have to try and keep it subtle so that it doesn't just become the accent show. I try and place women at a different point within my voice so that they're a little bit lighter, and I naturally have quite a low voice. I'm a sort of bass baritone, so the women have less resonance and are sort of more shallow in the mouth. But again, you try and play the situation and not the character, so you try not to put too much into the characterization just because it happens to be female. I have to say the one that really delighted me is Quantum of Solace, partly because of the revelation that it gives you on Bond's character. I mean, every actor wants to play James Bond, and perhaps not everybody gets to do it on film or television, but playing him on audio is a real privilege. And one does come to him thinking one knows what he thinks about certain things, particularly women. But that story proves one wrong, because he thinks he knows where he is, and then he listens very carefully to this man he's rather dismissed, and about this woman who he's totally dismissed. And he changes his mind. And I think that's rather touching, and not something one expects Bond to do very often. I think one of the reasons that everybody wants to play him is that he's a very dangerous, intelligent man with perhaps not normal levels of empathy, and to fantasize about being that person for a bit is interesting. I think actually being that person would be rather difficult, if not impossible. So the nice thing about reading him is that you get to be yourself again afterwards. But yes, he's complex. And I suppose there are various incarnations of the man on film that remind you more or less of his danger. I always think of the phrase "license to kill." It's not a license that I would ever want to have, and not many people, luckily, have got one. But if you've got one, it means you're a quite strange person, I think, and it's right that he should strike us as not quite human in that way. I think the thing that struck me in the narrative of the stories, above all, was how beautiful the descriptions are. Very measured and very subtle and very simple, and often quite long. And he seems a real master of that sense of description. There's a very strong sense of place and a very strong sense of geography. And one also gets the sense that Bond watches his surroundings very, very carefully, as somebody like him would have to do, as a matter of life or death. And one of the things that Fleming describes really well is birds. I'm a very keen bird watcher myself, and he clearly has an eye for birds, not just the Jamaican sort, but the ordinary British sort as well. Although sometimes the stories show their age, because there's a reference to a hedge sparrow in one of them, which is nowadays called a dunnock, and has been for a few years. Tunnock's tea cakes used to be called hedge sparrow tea cakes. I think the most important thing when you're reading is to decide what your register is. Who are you talking to? How many people are there? And where are they? Are they on the end of your bed? Are they sitting at the other end of the room? Are they the other side of a desk? Are there thousands of them and you're in a big field? And playing with those different registers is just one way of varying the job. I think it's very important to read the story as much as possible so that the register of the language gets under one's skin, as it were. And so that you can feel that you're doing your job by being part of the way the story is told, rather than just thinking, well, I read everything the same and this is how I read this. Not everything's written the same. Not all these stories are written the same. Quantum of Solace is very different from the Hildebrand Rarity, for instance. And so, like John Gielgud said, style is knowing what play you're in. I suppose reading is knowing what story you're in.
Thunderball by Ian Fleming. Read by Jason Isaacs.
I hadn't read Thunderball before. In fact, I hadn't read any Bond books. I'd seen the movies, obviously. And it was surprising how much character detail there was and how vulnerable Bond is, how full of doubt he is. That was something I hadn't expected. Well, the first thing that comes to mind is that it's very much of its time. So Bond's attitude to women and some of the vocabulary is so clearly dated and surprisingly interesting as well. Not just the stuff that nowadays would be thought of as racist or possibly sexist, but also how common phrases from today are inverted there, and I guess they became common parlance as we missaid them over the years. But mostly, I suppose I was amazed at how of the world they were. They mentioned product names all the time, and they're kind of currently political. I mean, he was writing about a world that he knew and a post-war reality that now seems rather fantastical to us, but was it's grounded in political context and global affairs. I found that surprising as well and interesting. One of the things I found unusual, if you haven't already heard the reading or read the book, I would cover your ears now, is that in the end, James Bond is saved by somebody else, which kind of breaks the paradigm for classical storytelling, but obviously works very well here. And it's surprising that such a, sexist is the wrong word, but such an old-fashioned dinosaur of a man, in the end, in this story, has to be rescued by the vulnerable girl and is in love with her. He trusts Domino with all that information. There are numbers of times that he goes so far out of what I would imagine to be the brief, were I 007, that it's shocking. But I think that's what makes him far more human, probably more human than I've experienced him in the movies. I loved reading Largo because he's larger than life. You know, there's almost something slightly Jacobean about calling him Largo. And he kind of eats up the world. And I like the kind of, a lot of the peripheral characters are interestingly drawn by Ian. He takes the time to bother to make one of the captains Canadian, or the captain of the submarine be slightly inappropriately jolly. So I like that. I liked getting my mouth around Italian accents. I was a little bit thrown, not wanting to do an impression of Blofeld from the movies, and also to find out that he is part Greek, part Polish, but a member of the international community, and that in terms of where one beds that in accent, I've no idea, so I just tried to represent it in attitude, and that's the best I could do. There are so many things that are interesting that are of the time, I suppose, and the attitude of the kind of men that Bond and the people surrounding him are like, for instance, how much they drink, and how okay it is for him in the middle of this crisis to go back to his room and order a double bourbon, and even to take the time to eat a sandwich and have a nap. But drugs and drink and the rest of it, there's certainly no postmodern attitude to it. But there's something I was very surprised by how trendy and satirical the opening sequence was, where Emma's suggesting all these health cures and alternative medicine, alternative food. It could easily have been written today. And not only that, I was also surprised by how, botched is the wrong word, but how rough and ready his plans are. The fate of the known world rests on his shoulders, and he sacrifices a bunch of the people from the submarine, the crew of the submarine, and anyway, they've only got spears, and so a number of them are going to get killed, and it's less slick, and it costs more, and is more fallible. I guess he's more fallible in every way than I'd imagined. I suppose that's what the main difference, if I had to crystallize it into one thing, he's human, the Bond in these books. He in the end, of course, he does save the world, but it's in a very human and mortal and fallible fashion. He doesn't do outlandish or outrageous or fantastical things. And I suppose the films have taken a different direction, and clearly very successfully so. But in the books, Bond is a man and gets a lot of things wrong and has desires and hopes and fears and insecurities and you get the feeling, even though you know what you're reading, that at any point calamity might strike. Bond actually does some spectacularly stupid things that lay him open, and in fact the whole defense of the Western world open to attack. He makes phone calls he shouldn't do. He trusts people. He certainly reveals everything to Domino and other people in ways that I found very surprising and intriguing. It's what makes the books a great read.
The Spy Who Loved Me by Ian Fleming, read by Rosamund Pike. I hadn't read The Spy Who Loved Me, and of course it's very, very different from the film. In fact, the story bears almost no resemblance to the film at all, except for perhaps the villain horror's metal-capped teeth inspired Jaws. Of course, it's an interesting book because it's the only one that's narrated by a woman, and you think, well, why did Ian Fleming, after writing all these Bond books, decide to explore the subjective point of view of a woman? And he does it pretty successfully, I'd say, on the most part. I mean, Bond doesn't actually come in until about page 90, and the first part of the book is taken up almost entirely with this girl's recollections of two very different types of love affairs in England. I mean, they serve as counterpoint for Bond's masculinity when he comes in. It's a kind of female view of masculinity, I suppose, the whole book in a way. One of the things I really love about the book is the fact that Vivian, our heroine, comes from Montreal, which is a city I've spent time in, and strangely enough, I've also done her drive, the drive from Montreal to upstate New York, finishing in and around Albany. Of course, I didn't do it on a scooter, I did it in a hire car, but the journey was the same, and it's just very nice to be exploring in someone else's words an experience that you've had yourself. What's really fun about the books is all of Fleming's sort of period precise detail. I really like the fact, I don't know why, that when Vivian decides she's going to take this journey, take this road trip, she goes to Hammersmith to buy her scooter, and suddenly we can picture this Vespa dealer in Hammersmith taking her out on the nearest road, you know, trying to sell her the machine, and then giving her advice on what kind of gear to buy, which must have been something that, Fleming was interested in. I also like the descriptions of Vivian's clothes, and I always think there must have been some woman at some point in Fleming's life who inspired these descriptions. You know, there must have been some woman who wore fur-rimmed motorcycling goggles, or some woman who wore black velvet toreador pants that really caught his eye. I think, writers can reveal quite a lot about themselves without really meaning to, even if it was just a sort of passing catch of the imagination. I think probably one of the most striking things about this book is that the villains are perhaps less complex than in some of the other stories, or perhaps I should say they're less arch designers of doom and more petty thugs. They're less clever, in fact, than most of the villains in the other Bond novels. It's also unusual because Bond is on a mission that's not, in fact, a mission. He's just completed a job in Canada, in Toronto, and is just on this road passing through on his way to Washington and happens to stumble upon a girl in danger. It's not the normal kind of crisis that an MI6 agent would be sent out to repair or whatever. It's more the kind of dealing with horror and Slugsy is more the sort of preserve of sort of local police forces, not of a top secret MI6 agent. Least of all 007. It's always fun doing a book like this. I mean, you kind of read the book and every time a new voice comes in, you think, oh my God, why couldn't he just be English? Why does he have to be Welsh? Or whatever the, particular dialect that the writer has blithely chosen, never foreseeing that someone's going to have to voice that character one day. But no, it's fun. I mean, you get into it, and when you're sitting in the booth, you suddenly find that your whole body posture's changed. And, I think by the time I got to the police detective at the end, smoking his cigarettes and sitting on the bench, I think I was kind of sitting in a very unfeminine fashion, I should say. I think I became rather kind of heavy set and sluggish in my movements.
On Her Majesty's Secret Service by Ian Fleming. Read by David Tennant. I'd never read the book before. No, I have read some of the James Bond novels, but I'd never read this one. I knew the film. I knew all the films quite well, I guess, and On Her Majesty's Secret Service is always a bit of a, I suppose it's a bit of a curiosity because it's George Lazenby's only appearance. And it's also a longer film, and in some ways a darker film than many of them. So I suppose that was my experience of it up to now. But no, I hadn't read the book, so I wasn't entirely sure what to expect. I was surprised at how, obviously, chicken and egg. The book came before the film, but not in my experience, and I was surprised at how loyal the movie was to the book, actually. The big set pieces are all quite recognisable, and the characters on the whole are very recognisable. And I think, I dare say that's a tribute to the narrative of this book, that it was hard to resist when they came to film it. And yes, it's got a sort of forward momentum and a drive which carries you through. And then, of course, you have this extraordinary thing where James Bond, the kind of ultimate bachelor, gets married, which I think is always. Again, I was aware that this was the episode of the story in which that happened, but it still comes as a surprise. I mean, I think it comes as a surprise to Bond himself in the book, but it comes as a surprise to me as the reader too. It seems to come from left field, in this extraordinary kind of decision he makes in the airport to suddenly get wed, which he seems to then make sense of to himself retrospectively, which I think is quite interesting, as observing this extraordinary character. I love M. I've always loved M, in the books and in the various incarnations on screen, I suppose. But that sort of that kind of stuff and nonsense. Englishness, that kind of, that won't put up with anything, and finds the whole thing, although he's dealing with kind of life and death of the entire civilization, it's all sort of stuff and nonsense and not to be taken seriously, and really we should all just sit down and have a cup of tea. I find that an endlessly fascinating character. So I think he might have been a favourite. But Irma Bunt is quite pleasing as well. Just this kind of, there's very little to commend her, really. She's a little sort of troglodyte with a kind of extraordinary way around her. There's nothing flattering in any of the descriptions of her throughout the entire book, but there's something quite appealing about this little creature that still bounces along and seems utterly undefeatable. And indeed, by the end of the book, she lives to fight another day. I suppose when you're reading out loud, the stuff that's most challenging is probably the kind of big set piece action sequences, just because you've got to, the pace has got to fly, so you've got to be on top of that. And but because they're well written, because they're exciting, of course, the pace is so inherent in the text that it just it takes you with it. he writes very long sentences. It's something I don't really realise when I read it in my head, but when you're trying to do it out loud, you find yourself running out of breath now and then, and the clauses and the subclauses. But really, the thing that's been most challenging is the French and the German and the pronunciations of everything from around the world, and every dish and every bottle of wine. And it's hard not to see it sometimes as Mr. Fleming rather showing off his knowledge and his life as a bon viveur, and forcing us all to be rather jealous and mystified at the wonderful enigma of a life we can only dream of. Of course, it's part of the world, so you've got to. But yes, I suppose that would be the single biggest challenge of reading it, just conquering the French and the German, I think.
You Only Live Twice by Ian Fleming. Read by Martin Jarvis. I read the book, You Only Live Twice, some years ago. I think it's an extraordinary book and rather different from the other Fleming Bond books because it does two things. It's an extraordinary thriller about what a man might do to take revenge on something that has happened to him. His wife has been murdered, and this is Bond's wife. But also, it's an incredible journey into a different culture, a culture that I think that many of us are only dimly aware of, or certainly when the book was first published in 1964. We didn't know about the heart of Japan, how they approach their world, their politics, their religion, and how they live their lives. And I found it extraordinarily pleasurable to try and inhabit the heart of this book. And I found it really quite inspiring. I've always known that Fleming's prose is hugely graceful and perspicacious. But this is something slightly different, I think, from the other great adventures. As with all Fleming, because he's a great thriller writer as well as a great novelist, I just love the structure of the whole novel that starts with a very depressed 007, a 007 who can hardly get up in the morning, who has lost his mojo, if you like, because of what has recently happened to him, which was the death of his new wife. And so you don't quite know where this is going, and you think, in a way, it's ended before it's begun. What are they going to do? Is M going to fire his erstwhile great 007? In fact, he is persuaded, because there's a psychological element to this, persuaded by the Secret Service psychiatrist to give Bond one more chance and perhaps give him some responsibility so that his own worries take second place to the worries that M has in terms of a connection with Japan. And that's how the trigger of the book is shot from the beginning. And then we go on this extraordinary journey where, so often in the Fleming novels, our hero travels from London to these various places of adventure and then immerses himself in a different kind of culture, so much so that he actually becomes a Japanese. And I don't want to give too much away for those who don't know the story, but the DNA of this novel is very interesting indeed, and on the face of it, it's an adventure and an examination of at the heart of a particular kind of Japanese darkness, and it also goes into the psychology of Bond and what you must do if you want to, as he does, take revenge on world domination villains. And it's no secret that our villain, who appears at some stage in the book, is Ernst Blofeld. And that was very pleasurable to try and get into his psyche. And there's this wonderful character of Tiger Tanaka, who is Japanese and who has to have a very different colour in his voice, to contrast, of course, with our hero. And that was fascinating for me as an actor or an inhabitor to dig down into that DNA and try and make him live. And what I thoroughly enjoy and have enjoyed the opportunity to inhabit this particular book is that I don't like to think of it as a reading. Of course, the hidden agenda is that the listener is being read to. I like to feel that if I can shoot the pictures in my head, the pictures that Fleming has imagined and described in his graceful prose, if I can just take it somewhere beyond that and see the pictures he's giving us, giving me as the reader, I'm hoping that people sort of half forget they're being read to and just see the pictures in their own head. The pictures might be slightly different, of course, in their own heads, but if I can dream them truthfully, then they can take off the dream their end and feel they are in the various moments of this extraordinary novel. I very much liked attempting to play this remarkable young woman, Kissy Suzuki, and see if I can sort of make that happen. If I played her on television, or I couldn't play her, of course, and you'd have a wonderful Japanese actress to do it, but Fleming and all writers give you the permission through their own narrative to be these characters. So instead of, we hope, people laughing at me and saying, look at Martin trying to be a Japanese young woman, because Fleming might say, and then Kissy came towards Bond and said quietly, I've already given myself, through Ian, permission to then say, oh, James, I love you. And they won't laugh at me, we hope, because it is a story and it's storytelling. But of course I couldn't do that if I was on the stage or just playing the part on the screen.
The Man with the Golden Gun by Ian Fleming, read by Kenneth Branagh. I had not read Man with the Golden Gun before, but it was a memorable Bond movie, and I think the character of Scaramanga, both his name, his particular marking, having this third nipple, made him memorable and sort of unsettling, was a very vivid character and a very vivid story that was unsettling and also one of the most glamorous of the Bond stories, in my view. And so I found in reading The Man with the Golden Gun, a number of things struck me. One is the darkness of mood, that there is a preoccupation and a sense of gravity about the taking of life, something that the Bond films sometimes suggest, which is that there can be a casualness or callousness about the way in which Bond is involved in the assassination business, is, I think, debated more in the pages of the novel. And so the sense of the personal cost to someone like Bond, the moral question, if not a dilemma for him, but the moral question of the taking of a life, even in a job that is bound to require that you consider it and often do it, still very pertinent, very current for him. So there's more chewy internal reflection and conjecture that's well put, even if it's in the context of a man's world and a man's man and a sort of oldie world view, and, you know, in some cases, in various characters, a sexist view of the world, and a tough and ruthless view of the world from a particular perspective and moment in history. But it's darker, it's more morally complex, and I think the enjoyment of writing atmosphere, conveying Jamaica, generally placing the reader and the audio listener in the, hopefully, in the heat of Jamaica, in the atmosphere, in the place, the atmosphere of place, the sweltering heat, and the effect on people's actions, their reactions. All of that is very vividly done. So it's very transporting. It does take you to another place, another time, and into another world, the world of a hot Caribbean country, and also the world and mind of a ruthless professional. the character of Mr. Hendricks, he I found to be an interesting character, and I think I have the sense that there was enjoyment from the author in writing him. He makes him a little comic at times, but he makes it seem as though the character himself is using humour or an apparently sort of Teutonic, implacable quality to sometimes protect himself. Happy to be the butt of jokes if it keeps him sort of invisible or his intentions invisible. And then there's a lovely relish of the rather feral animal gathering of the hoods, the mafiosa types who have bought into this scheme that Scaramanga is the broker of, that in theory makes them all rich. Involves, of course, exploitation and an uneasy alliance with security organizations. And that in itself provides a sort of an interesting moment when, through Hendricks, there's the discussion of whether the KGB dare allow themselves to be involved in more speculative ventures that are purely about raising money when everything, in their view, ought to have a political objective. So the sort of morality of what large, ruthless intelligence organizations ought to be investing their money in is sort of amusingly discussed, with some rather bitter ironies around that. What the book seems to capture well is the lust for mammon, the greed, hunger for gain and finance and gambling. Fleming does take you to the roulette table. He does somehow put you on the edge of the card game, and he gives you a hand of cards whether you like it or not, and the book encourages you to play. I've never been troubled, nor need I ever be troubled, by the idea of playing Bond in anything other than this lovely opportunity to read The Man with the Golden Gun. But I enjoy the Bond villains, and already even to call them Bond villains is to somehow sort of cheapen or make it a little superficial, because there's so many really excellent performances from people in the movies, and obviously beyond that and before that, characterizations and characters on the page. But I do enjoy those with a plan for world domination. I do enjoy that, and I enjoy them thinking that they're right, and I like it when they have what appears to be an ideological kind of underpinning of that, so that they are not simply deluded or deranged. I like the idea of playing someone who is that very dangerous combination of skillful and powerful, and perhaps especially dangerous because they believe.
Octopussy by Ian Fleming, read by Tom Hiddleston. I read Dr. No when I was a child in my mid-teens. I mean, I've been a huge fan of James Bond all my life. Like most people, my first engagement with the character was through the films, and my father was the man who said actually they were based on a series of novels by Ian Fleming, and that they were great, and he had a couple of them on his bookshelf. So I thought I'd start at the beginning. I'm not even sure that Dr. No is the first novel that Fleming wrote. In fact, it's not. But because it was the first film, it seemed appropriate to me in my 14-year-old brain, and that's why I should start. But I remember being very surprised by how different in tone the novels were, and how they were somehow more dense, but also leaner and more serious than the films that I'd seen. And I really enjoyed it. I mean, it's the perfect thing to read if you're a teenage boy. It's absolutely what you want at that point in your life. I love all the characters that I've read in these three stories are so colourful and rich, and have given me huge freedom to inflect them with, different accents and attitudes. I particularly love a couple of characters. I love Major Dexter Smythe in Octopussy. He seems to be a man of such faded, sad past glory that he's sort of withering away in self-destruction, but in his own mind, he's living the high life, and he just seems to me to be a very colourful character, someone who in his mind is very decorated from his time in the military, but actually he's living in a gin palace and is obsessed with fish, and it's all going downhill quite fast. I had lots of fun kind of making him sound very old school and pompous and deceitful and wriggling on the wall of James Bond's line of inquiry. I think what's so wonderful about Octopussy and all the stories, but this one particularly, is it reveals Fleming's passions and his expertise in certain areas. He was obviously a keen swimmer, and I think knew fish and the reef from swimming off Goldeneye in Jamaica, and so I think he's infused all of that knowledge and expertise throughout the story, all stuff of scorpion fish stings and the octopus itself. You can also see it in the story with Hannes Oberhauser. There's a lot of German details in there, and you can see Ian's past experience of Germany and speaking German, and I think he, as a writer, gets a little thrill of sort of peppering the book with German names and German places and German terms, and it's fun to read too. Property of a Lady is the most surprising of the stories to me, because it's, on the face of it, the stakes are quite low for James Bond. It's not life or death, and it seems like a kind of a day in the life. It starts with a very an atmosphere of ennui and boredom, and it's a lazy summer, and no one's got any work to do, and everyone's desperate to do something, and suddenly Bond gets a sniff of a lead, and he chases it, and he's thrilled by it in a quiet way. And I loved that it's very atmospheric, and it's so full of detail, and you can feel that Ian Fleming loves writing Bond's curiosity about this world, this world of high art that really James Bond has nothing to do with, and would have no particular interest in his personal life. But when the KGB are involved, it seems fun, and you can feel that Ian Fleming obviously knew a lot about this world, but he enjoys kind of revealing it to James Bond as he goes through the story. It just was an eye opener to me in terms of the depth of the character of James Bond, and also Fleming's capacity for evoking our sympathy for him. I like James Bond so much in this story. He's fun. I like his interest. I like his sort of gentle mockery of some of the strange characters he meets in that world. I've never bid. I don't have. I wish I did, but I don't have that kind of money. I've bid at charity auctions to sort of try and help raise the bidding. But I've never been stuck with the final asking price. I think that'd be terrifying. Yeah, it's one of those, bidding at an auction is one of those things where you feel you'd feel that at any moment the bidding could stop with you, and you have to go home with it and pay the price that you said you pay. But it's very competitive, and my deeply flawed masculine instinct kicks in, and I want to kind of outbid whoever else I'm competing with. But it's folly. It's a terrible idea, so I have to stop myself. I'm not a big fan of Captain Sender. I think he's a job's worth. The Living Daylights I really enjoyed. I mean, all three of them have such different tones and different atmospheres. The Living Daylights to me is the coldest, but that doesn't mean to say that it's any less appealing. The Living Daylights is a story that really lays out Bond's pragmatism and his very precise skill level at his job. You get a sense of the man without adornment, without charm. And that's no less interesting. In fact, to my mind, it's more interesting in many ways. Bond in this story he has a job to do, which is to kill a man, and to do it after the 3 days have passed, or in the space of 3 days. And what I like about that is the job description is so simple, and his approach to the job is very personal and practical. But in that, in the depiction of the approach, you actually get a window into the soul of the man and this fantasy relationship he has with this girl in the orchestra. It makes him seem like behind all this pragmatism and this lean muscle that he has, is an imagination, a very poetic imagination, and a mind that is cultivated and sophisticated and understands the sensitivity of music and art, and yet he's there with a gun in his hand. The way I find voices is it's completely instinctive, and as far as I know, I've been doing it all my life. It was one of the things I did as a child. I would do impressions. I was a bit like a parrot or one of those birds that can repeat a tune back to you. I don't even know if there is a real bird, so maybe I've read it in a book. But I've always loved the signs that people unconsciously tell you about who they are by the way they speak. And it could be that they are cold people, or they're just withdrawn and reserved people, or they're extrovert or introvert, or arrogant or snobbish. It tells you about class and status. And I think if more people were aware of it, they wouldn't speak in the way they spoke. I love changing the way I speak, I suppose. They're huge fun to do.
007 in New York by Ian Fleming. Read by Lucy Fleming. 007 in New York's an odd little story. It was first published in October 1963, and Ian's original title was Reflections in a Carey Cadillac, which I rather like. He travelled around the world writing his views of major cities, and towards the end of his travel he came to New York, and he didn't write very flatteringly about it. Partly, I think, because he was quite exhausted, and partly, I think, because it wasn't a particularly good time for New York. You know, there were strikes, there were scandals. And one has to remember that it was a sort of period piece. In those days, 5-star hotel rooms were $20, and he had to explain what sushi was, things like that. It's an interesting time. But when the Thrilling Cities book was published in America, Ian was encouraged to write something a little bit more about New York, and this is what he said. By way of a postscript, I might say that I'm well aware these grim feelings I've expressed for New York may shock or depress some of my readers. In deference to these readers, I here submit a record of another visitor to the city, a friend of mine with the dull name of James Bond, whose taste and responses are not always my own, and whose recent minor adventure in New York, his profession is rather an odd one, may prove more cheerful in the reading.